Hello. It works. So thank you very much. Which doesn't mean that I need to stay around here. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Joao, for your talk. It was really nice to remember again these Carnot maps that I hadn't seen for 15 years. I was feeling really old. You do look younger. You don't look like being born in the 81. So I come here to talk about a completely different topic. I'm going to be talking about web development and how we can combine all of this modern tooling to create sites that load fast and they have good performance. I'm a software engineer working at Spotify. I've been working there for more than 6 years. And I'm also a Google developer expert in web technologies, which pretty much means that I spend some time writing posts about web development and I give a couple of talks here and there. I don't know if I can increase the volume a bit, but yeah. Let's see if this works. Yeah, so a quick summary of what we are going to be talking about. We are going to see how we are using model libraries and frameworks these days. We will see a bit of ES6, which is the syntax that we like to use for writing JavaScript. I will talk about code splitting, CSS in JavaScript, and finally how we can combine all of these in order to create sites that really load fast. I think I'm speaking for myself, but I think that pretty much every web developer likes to use modern tools. It's really a challenge keeping up to everything that is going on. Like it seems like every day we have a couple of new UI libraries, then another one for state management, then another place to host all the data, and a couple of other new browser APIs. And it's almost impossible unless we have the time to work on this during working hours. Like very few people find the time to investigate all of this during their free time. I was having a look at the State of JavaScript report. This is a report that was published a couple of days ago. It's they gather data from 20,000 web developers that they were giving opinions on the different libraries that you can use these days to build sites, and they would say whether they know the tool, whether they want to continue using it, or if they don't, and whether they would like to learn. So I picked the most famous ones, and it's pretty evident that lots of people have been using React and they would like to use React. Vue is also kind of similar. Fewer people have used it, but lots of people would like to learn how to use them. And all of these tools, they are very few years old. And things like GraphQL, for instance, is pretty recent. And when we talk about these tools, we tend to try to prioritize developer ergonomics, which means what tools are going to make our lives easier as developers. And we don't think so much about user experience. And that's something that I really want to talk about. So instead of just saying, yeah, I will use React and then I can define my state and then the UI will, the library will do everything that it needs to in order to update the UI. Like, how does that affect users? And we tend to think that by choosing better tools, we are going to be able to develop faster, which is going to end up benefiting the user because we are going to be shipping more features and more solid with fewer errors. But we don't take into account the user experience directly when choosing these tools. And some of them, they do have an impact. We also tend to blame the user if we need to support some low-end device. We normally complain, why do we need to support this crappy old Android phone? Can't they buy a new one? Working at Spotify, this is these days quite evident. We are expanding emerging countries where they can't afford having a phone or, I mean, the kind of phones that we are using these days here. So it's very difficult to prioritize those phones when everyone is using Macs and iPhones at the office with 4G or super fast speeds. Something else that we like to blame is browsers. Do we need to support IE11? Do we need to support IE10? And again, it might be that the user can't install a new version. Sometimes we think that if only they had Chrome, then everything would work great. But it turns out that lots of users, they can't even install the updates. So I'm working on the Spotify's web player, which is used a lot during weekdays, from Monday to Friday, both for people that are working at offices and for students that are at schools. They have their permissions locked and they cannot install any update. They cannot install anything. That's one of the reasons why they are using the web player and they don't use the desktop application that they have to install. So again, sometimes we like to think that if only everyone uses the same thing, but it turns out that that's not possible. As developers, we need to take it into account. And finally, network connectivity. We also think, okay, it might be slow the first time, but then a returning visitor will get everything loaded pretty fast. But that's not always the case. Even during that first visit, it might be that everything's slow. You might be on a plane. If that's like a first world issue, being on a plane and having some connectivity. But you might be on the subway, you might be using some public shared Wi-Fi, and your data connectivity might also be crappy because maybe you already used all the data you had in your plan, and now you are using like 3G. So I feel a bit old when I talk when I talk about web development, because I remember the days when we used to do progressive enhancement and building websites pretty much on HTML and then adding JavaScript only as an add-on. So if the user happened to be running JavaScript, then they would have a better experience. I think we've moved away from that, and these days we are embracing a different way of building applications. And that's using components that get together and then they build the whole experience. And some of you, if you've been using React, you will know this guy. And if you've been using Vue, you will know this other guy. So I'm not a huge proponent of using React or Vue. There's a lot of religious people that really prefer one of them, and they are like, yeah, this is my code, and I'm going to go wherever he goes. And yeah, it's just a tool to do the thing. I mentioned that I was working on Spotify's web player. If you have never used it, this is pretty much what it looks like. And when we talk about components, we are not limited to UI components, but pretty much everything is a component. So you have routing through a component called router. So every path, every time you go to one of these sections and it loads a different path, that's also going to be a component. We have also UI components like tab bar. That doesn't come for free using the web platform. The web gives you buttons and it gives you links, but it doesn't give you these more complex components. You can even create components out of other components, something called high order components. So in this case, I have here a cover art, which is a cover art image, and then a lazy load component that is going to lazy load whatever it gets. So that image will only get loaded when it's within the viewport, the visible area. And if you've ever used Redux, you are familiar with a connect function that connects a component to the shared state of the application. So again, we are using that to keep track of what's playing, or the volume, or the progress bar. When we started working on these single page applications and also on the web player, it was very difficult to have something like this, serving to the user pretty much an empty page with a script tag. And that bundle.js, it's a huge piece of code that has all the code for your application. And that translates pretty much to this for a few seconds. You don't have anything to show to the user. They need to download that big chunk, and they need to execute it, and then start making requests to some API to start painting something on the screen. In many cases, you end up with something like this, where your application code is only that bit there, that is the visible part, and then all in the bottom is the framework code. And you might be thinking about, okay, but React is not a framework, it's just a library. But then you need to pull so many libraries when you're working with React, like a router, like state management, that in the end, it turns out something like this. And we tend to use all these tools, even for the simplest project, where we might have very little code. I found this report. It has been mentioned in a couple of performance talks, and I thought it was really fun. It's a study by Ericsson where they found out that experiencing mobile delays was causing a similar level of stress to users than watching a horror movie. Actually, I would say it's even pretty much equivalent to solving a math problem. And working on the web is super challenging because people are getting used to use mobile applications. So when they go to a site, they expect it to load really fast, no matter what. And it's a problem. People they are not so used to wait anymore. Someone might say that the solution is to server-side render an application. I see those things as paths, and I'm going to explain a little bit why. When we have a client-side rendering, we wait a bit for getting that response with the empty body, which is the blank page, and then we need to fetch everything and render it. When we work on server-side rendering, that super big chunk, we need to wait a bit more because the server needs to render that on the server side. But then there's this part here which becomes a problem. That translates to having a UI where the user taps on a button, but nothing happens because they still need to download that big piece of the code to execute the JavaScript and to attach all the events. So you end up delivering the experience very quickly, but a crap experience. They can't really interact with it. So the only solution is to break that piece of pie, that big bundle, and serve to the user just what they need. So I'm going to explain how we can combine all these different tools to do exactly this. We used to do web in a very crappy way. If you've ever used WordPress, it's pretty much how it still works. You import jQuery and then you import lots of different plugins. And if you have a map, then you import the Maps API. And you don't really know if in the page that you are loading, you have a map or not. You don't know if you are going to have a certain component, a certain element that needs jQuery or jQuery UI. You don't know. You just load it just in case, because somewhere in the page or on some page on the site, you might need it. So it was really difficult to keep track of the different dependencies. And there wasn't really any way to do that. Some big companies like Facebook and Google, they created their own way of defining dependencies and loading different other modules. There was also a UI loader, maybe Require.js rings you some bell. It turns out that not that many people use them. I think the big change came with ES6 and defining imports and exports. ES6 has many good stuff, like syntactic sugar pretty much, but I think the most important bit is the import and export. You can have a library defining several functions or constants and only import what you need. And then using a tool like Webpack or Parser is going to remove the code that is not used. And that's called tree shaping. So if you think about the website, a website is just a set of pages. So those pages could be modules that you import, and then you render the one that should be rendered in that moment. But then something more powerful is having dynamic loading, where you can import different modules depending on what path you are in. So it doesn't make sense to load the contact module if I'm in the about page. This idea of dynamic loading allows us to break that bundle into a smaller one. We still have to serve this thing with some common functionality, but then we can break it into smaller chunks that are loaded as you navigate through the site. And that's code splitting at the path level. So this is great. You just serve the code that you need for the current path. And more importantly, you can add more features, you can add more pages, and that's not going to have any performance impact. So it doesn't matter if you suddenly need to add 10 more pages to your site, it's going to load in the same way. So we go from something like this, where we have loading time increasing as you increase the amount of features, to something more constant. Then the same approach that we are seeing to split through different paths, we can have it also within the same page. If we think that this is a long page and that's what the user is seeing, it doesn't make sense to render all of this. This can be a big image and we don't need it yet. The user might never scroll down there. So why do we want to load it? Just in case, okay. If only there was a better way to know if the user is there. And there are better ways to do that. There are lots of libraries, and there's one new browser API called Intersection Observer that is going to give us exactly that. That thing can be an image, but it can also be things. It can be text with some custom web form. So if we don't render that text, we don't need to make the request to the custom web form. And more importantly, it can be other components with their own logic. They can be quite heavy. Imagine, for instance, a map there. So we don't need to load the code for the map. So this is even greater. We just serve the code for the current screen. If you've ever had to support all browsers, you will be familiar with polyfills. Polyfills is a bunch of JavaScript that you add just to recreate some functionality that a modern browser already supports. So in some way, you are penalizing modern browsers. You're not making use of that modern technology. You are delivering just in case that browser doesn't support it. Using these lazy loading techniques give us polyfills on demand. So here, that intersection observer API that I mentioned before, we can check for its presence. And if it's not present, then I can import it. This is an example where we have a website, and when we scroll down, we are going to make a request to show a map for Google Maps. Again, all those requests are made from the very beginning. They are only made when we scroll down and we need to render the map. Something like this on Safari that doesn't support intersection observer will result in an extra request to get the polyfill, intersection observer polyfill. So we don't need to serve that to every browser. So it's a really powerful way of only serving what is needed. So it's not only what's needed for the screen, but for the screen and the current browser. Now, to wrap this up, I want to mention CSS in JavaScript. If you are not familiar with it, it's pretty ugly the first time you see it. So you write CSS within JavaScript files. That bit there. Lots of people were horrified when they first saw JSX during the React presentation, because it was breaking the separation of concerns, having HTML in one place and JavaScript in another place. And this adds more towards that. Now you mix everything in a JavaScript file. So lots of people are like, yeah, that's really ugly. What's the point in that? People are using it because they don't understand the cascade. What's the point in that? And I was a bit like that. I never got to understand it until I started playing a bit with it. And it turns out that you can achieve also code splitting, because in this example, I have a model there and I have some styles. Those styles are only needed if I'm going to show a model. Otherwise, we don't need to show them. We don't need to request them. So it's a really good way of also splitting that big style CSS. And if you follow the same approach, you will end up with several JavaScript files that also contain some CSS in them. But again, if we need some CSS in some page, then we only load it when we navigate to that page. And if you have ever used something like Bootstrap, it was really difficult to split Bootstrap down. And in the end, you just loaded it, and you didn't make use of 90% of the styles from the Bootstrap CSS file. So this is really amazing, because you can not only serve the code for the current screen and browser, but really break this behemoth of JavaScript and CSS for once. So you really, really only serve what's needed. So just to wrap up, lots of people talk about JavaScript fatigue. And these days, I used to have more time to explore these things, but nowadays I don't have that much time. I had a baby recently, and suddenly you realize that it changes everything. And that time that you used to spend exploring stuff, you don't have it. But whenever I can, I give it a try. I try to use some of these tools for small projects at work, and I try to see if there's any benefit. And normally, there's this phase of something new that I think some people jump and they try to use it just because it's new. But if you wait a bit, you start seeing how that plays with other libraries and other approaches. So try to forget a bit about JavaScript fatigue. These are just tools. So add them to your toolbox, and then try to have a look at the bigger picture. Something like CSS in JavaScript can be seen from the perspective of this is completely unnecessary, or it can be seen as, oh, this plays really well with this other technique, and then we can have a site that only loads what's needed. So yeah, try to avoid having this JavaScript fatigue. We are all trying to catch up with everything that is new, and we will never be able to do that. I'm pretty sure during this time I've been giving the talk, some people have been releasing new libraries for doing pretty much everything. So yeah, that was pretty much it. Thank you very much. And I guess there's some time for questions. Yes. Sorry? Helm? I must say I don't, I've read something about it, but okay. I think the good thing is that you start thinking about components, and then you can isolate everything in a component. And when you think that the style is also part of the component, then there's no reason to have it outside. So it's really nice to just have it there because it's part of the component. It also has some other benefits. If you're using something like React Storybook, you can import that component and see what it looks like. You can even create a unit test on top of that. You can create actually tests that render the component. You can compare pixel by pixel. So it's really powerful when you take it and and explore the different possibilities. But it's a matter of, I think, stopping a bit and seeing if some of these tools get traction, and then you start seeing how people work on integrating it with some existing tools. And that's when the real power of these modern tools comes out. Yes. Yes. Yeah, there's a whole world called progressive web apps that I didn't mention. It's a set of APIs. The most important one is service workers. So in some way, taking control of the network, so you don't need to make requests to the server. You can catch things locally and you can serve them from there. That's super powerful and it's really relevant when we talk about performance. It allows you to have applications that work offline, for instance, or you can also do background synchronization. You can load the latest version of the assets in the background, so the user, whenever they go through your website, they get the first version. You don't need to pull those assets. There are also push notifications that also are supported using service workers. So I think service workers is the main thing. Google is pushing for that a lot. And they see it as a way of implementing web applications that pretty much behave like a regular native application. And we are exploring some of that for again in Spotify. We are right now working a bit more on a mobile web player because this web player that I showed, that's built for desktop, but it doesn't work really well on mobile. It has lots of assumptions about all the different features that we need to have there. So there's another thing that is working on a slim down version, and that they are focusing more on performance budget using Lighthouse and also looking at using service workers. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So,